Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I know the welcome screen is still on. We are going to wait another minute or so for people to join the webinar, and then we will get started. Now you can see us. So very excited to have this webinar today. As I mentioned, we'll just wait another minute. Start at 9:05. And we'll be on our way. Very well. I think we will get started now. So let me welcome you all to this third webinar that's part of a thematic briefing series that is really looking at technology and inclusion, technology and engagement with communities that are primarily affected by disaster. Before we get started, let me just say a couple of caveats. Is that I will be introducing people coming from different organizations. So I want to emphasize that the views expressed do not represent those of the organization represented, nor of Harvard University. And let me also acknowledge and thank here the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at USAID, who has provided support for this webinar and a series of case studies that it relates to. So what are these case studies? As I was just mentioning, this is the third webinar of a series that accompanies studies and reviews that we have been conducting in the field that really emerged from the realization that the humanitarian sector has been changing, and there are a number of commitments that were taken as part of the Grand Bargain, but also of the digital transformation of humanitarian actors. And in many ways, our studies and experience shows that the digital transformation of humanitarian action, and at the same time, the commitments to localization, the commitments to more support for local and national organization have largely evolved separately as different transformation, and at times have been counterproductive with each other, where we've seen, in fact, re-centralization around technology. And while a lot of rhetoric exists around putting people at the center of digital transformation, we do see major efforts to gain in efficiency around technology, but not necessarily gaining in aspects of protection, respect for persons, autonomy. And so, again, kind of emerging tension at this nexus. So we undertook a series of case studies to look at how can we better bridge that gap? How can we better ensure that digital transformation is done in partnership, in collaboration, engaging with affected communities. One key audience are women. Obviously, we understand that access to technology can be gender specific, that there is a real risk for technological innovation, for the use of technology to reinforce structural inequalities. We also understand that women may experience unique, unexpected, unintended consequences from the use of technology. So one of the case studies was designed around this question. How do we make engagement, the deployment, the creation, the innovation around technologies more inclusive of women's perspective? So we're fortunate today to be joined by three wonderful speakers who have deep experience in this topic. First is Sophia Sebastian. She's a senior analyst, with more, it's also early for me, so time difference doesn't play my favor. She has 15 years working in think tank, academic and diplomatic environments, conducting qualitative, in-depth, quantitative research as well, providing expert advice on peace building, humanitarian practice, and international peace and conflict. She has authored a book on peace building, highly recommended, on peace conflict, post-conflict and divided societies, and she has worked with different organizations and international organizations, both Europe and the US. One key aspect of hers is that Sophia was the lead author on the case study around women's inclusion in humanitarian technology, and the link to that case study will be shared later in the event today. We're also joined by Benita Roche, who is the Regional Innovation and Technology Advisor for CARE. She advised on the ethical and appropriate use of ICTs, emerging technologies, cybersecurity, and digitalization to increase access to vital service in agriculture, civil society, education. You can see from this description how relevant her work is for our discussion. She has experience in more than 15 fragile and post-conflict countries and emerging market settings. Finally, we're joined by Lilian Asham. She's the director of Access Plus. She's a tech enthusiast, aren't we all? But also realist and really researcher on with extensive experience in researching and advocacy for inclusive access to technology, with primary interest, of course, on women and girls. So again, wonderful to have someone with such a relevant expertise for our discussion today. Lilian believes in inclusive information communication technology, that when those technologies are used to empower society, it brings about more opportunities for employment, economic growth, better livelihoods. In the past 3 years, she has worked to establish multiple women-led community networks in different regions of Africa. So again, thank you to all of you for joining us today. Without further ado, I will leave you the floor, Sophia, so that you can talk about your experience, your findings, conducting these case studies, interviews, reviewing the literature, about a year of work. So thank you so much for doing that, and looking forward to hear some of your key findings. Over to you. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you to the panelists to be with us today, for taking the time to be here in this very important discussion. As you said, my remarks today are going to be in the context of the research that I conducted based on a thorough desk research and more than 30 interviews with key informants. The inclusion of women in ICT innovation and programming in humanitarian context is a huge topic. There's so many layers, so many dimensions that we could discuss today, but I'm going to provide a general overview of some of the main challenges that we found in our research, and Lilian and Benita will dive into some of these issues in more depth. First of all, there are two main sector-wide challenges that I would like to briefly mention. One is the very nature of the humanitarian context. Given the rapidly evolving environment of humanitarian context, there is sometimes this view, this perception that humanitarians don't have the time to sit down and really think about women and how to include women and other groups in their response. The second one is that despite being considered a cross-cutting issue, gender inclusion, we found that generally remains an extra activity, an add-on to a project just to improve it, rather than an overall system approach. So with that said, while technology could potentially help with these challenges and increase the reach of humanitarian assistance, in reality, technology can actually increase the risk of inclusion for two main reasons. One is because of the inherent bias. Technology is not a neutral tool. On the contrary, it's a tool that is being designed, developed, and implemented by people with their own preferences, their own perspectives, which tends to have which can insert certain biases against certain groups, including women, especially if they're not participating in the design of those tools. There is also an extrinsic or external bias because of certain groups limit access to technology. In other words, there is a risk of exclusion for those with less access to technology, which can lead to a digital divide or the unequal access to digital services offered by humanitarians. In the case of women, some of these limitations are related to affordability, time, literacy, relevance, and safety. But based on this research and our interviews, social and cultural norms that have the greatest impact on women's access to technology and to digital tools. So in short, with this introduction, what I just wanted to say is that technologies are not adopted in a political or social vacuum. They are designed, implemented by people with their own biases and their own perceptions, and they are used by individuals that have widely different levels of digital access and digital literacy. So for the potential benefits of technology to materialize in the context of humanitarian assistance, much depends on internal processes and policies in place and on the people implementing them. So in terms of processes, our research found that, generally speaking, and again, some organizations are doing better than others, there is a mismatch between the increasing use of digital tools in the humanitarian context and the development of practices and standards that ensure the inclusion of women and other groups. So again, aside from organizations, women tend to be excluded from meaningful engagement, and this was discussed in one of the previous webinars. In the context of ICT innovation and programming, they're typically involved only at certain stages, but not throughout the program cycle. In other words, ICT programs are sometimes designed for women, but less so with women. Another challenge or gap that we found in our research is related to needs assessments, which is a common practice in the sector. These have been slow in adopting basic questions around digital access and digital use among the population at risk, including women. Also, in part due to the lack of clear guidance on what specific questions to ask, what specific standards to use. The humanitarian sector has seen a proliferation of gender toolkits in this area, in this context, designed to provide some assistance and some direction in the use of ICTs. While some of these toolkits have become reference points, most tend to be too long, too dense, too time-consuming, and sometimes not particularly actionable for people on the ground. So this results in situations where toolkits are maybe not used or used only on an ad hoc basis. Timelines are also generally too short to undertake the kind of work that is required to ensure women are included. Addressing social norms, for example, requires a significant amount of time. When you have time and resources to design for women, you can focus on inclusivity, but if you're trying to roll out a program quickly with the whole population in mind, then things get a little bit more complicated. In terms of humanitarian organizations, we also found that there are important capacity, training, and financial gaps at the intersection of inclusion and technology. For example, you may have gender specialists inside an organization, you may have digital specialists, but maybe those two might not be talking to each other, or perhaps there are no gender specialists who understand or are familiar with ICTs, et cetera, et cetera. Again, some organizations are starting to understand this gap and starting to invest in this type of expertise. So in the end, ultimately, we found that it's often that it's up to individuals who are actually implementing the programs or procuring the technology to decide how much they make inclusion part of their work. Now, briefly, I want to touch upon a few recommendations based on what I just said. First of all, there is a need to fight the assumption that gender and inclusion is too hard in humanitarian context, and instead we need to think of it as an integral part of any project. The inclusion of women at the design stage of digital tools is also critical, so that products are appealing and useful to women. In other words, digital products need to consider women's literacy levels, preferences, and experiences, and must be informed by the digital gap and power dynamics. There is also a need to ensure that budget and time is allocated to allow implementers to have the time and the resources to really understand the digital ecosystem and understand women's digital access and use of technology. In this context, it's important to include a few digital access questions as part of needs assessments, especially when you're quickly rolling out a program in an emergency. And those are just very simple and straightforward questions. What access to technology do women have? What type of technology or digital tools are they already using? What are their perceived risks associated with the use of these digital tools, et cetera, et cetera. But those are important questions to really understand and create strategies to address any issues. Also, given time constraints in humanitarian context, it's also important to undertake much of the work required in an emergency prior to the crisis. For example, some organizations conduct regular ICT assessments of women in advance. It would also be really important to conduct a mapping analysis of women-led organizations based locally to partner with, because building relationship with some of these organizations, it's important. Flexible funding, also important for iterative approaches and more involvement of women throughout the whole cycle of ICT innovation and ICT programming. And I think I'm gonna leave it at that. I think there's a lot of information. Also working with woman-led organization is key, as I just mentioned, because they can provide critical access to communities and help reach women that otherwise would be left behind. But there are also gaps in that area. So I'm going to leave it there because I think that I throw out a lot of information, and I will just pass it on to our panelists, our speakers today.
Lillian, maybe I can ask you to comment from your perspective, your experience. You know, what have you learned? As we mentioned, you have worked. This is deeply your experience, your field. You've been setting up networks of women-led organizations throughout the world and in Africa. So does this echo your own experience? What are some of the challenges? And also, I would say, what are some of the practical recommendations? What can people like this audience do and need to consider in their own work? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sophia, for that wonderful presentation and the great work that you did. Just to add on what Sophia has mentioned, based on my experience working with women in rural and peri-urban communities of Uganda, Morocco, Senegal, Namibia, and Kenya, and other countries across sub-Saharan Africa. We still really have a long way. I'm speaking from the angle of developing countries. we still really have a very long way in terms of bridging the digital divide for humanitarian assistance. Like Sophia put it, women are largely really still consumers. I just call them consumers of digital products, and not really, because they're not really part of the entire process of designing and planning, designing and implementation of digital products. And because of that, you find that the products that come, that are being put out there for communities are targeting particular communities and leaving out the majority who do not have access to these kind of services. For instance, in the rural communities where we've worked, a lot of times the lack of access to digital tools, the lack of access to digital services like mobile money and all that is really attributed to the social norms. That is really, really very strong in the rural communities where we work with and where we come from. And so some of the ways that could really address some of these issues, like the traditional social norms, is to have inclusive participation, which also in the design and implementation, which also includes not only the women, but the men, like their partners as well. Because taking an example of a scenario where we are giving out these products, and in the community there are those husbands who feel like digital tools like smartphones actually are giving their wives wrong information. And according to them, information access family planning is actually wrong information that is misguiding, that is going to be misguiding their spouses. So what can, just the thought of that can actually bar them from accessing smartphones, from accessing any digital services, because the husband says so. And remember, the scenario in the rural communities where we work from is that these tools will be accessible in most cases by the men. Even when you give out some tools at some point, they actually take over that. So it involves inclusive involvement. It involves a lot of awareness creation to make sure that we address some of these issues like the social norms. The other thing that still would, to me, would help to solve some of these, if we have inclusive access, inclusive design and all that, where women are part of it all, is to make sure that in the design, yes, the women are part of it, but they also, they kind of, because of their involvement, they kind of take charge of what belongs to them. For instance, when it comes to information, the gadgets, for instance, the smartphones should probably come with information that is relevant to the women. information that is relevant to the women at such times like during the COVID-19 crisis. We were working with a group of HIV/AIDS women, and then suddenly there was lockdown, total lockdown, and they had no, in the entire group of like 30, none of them actually, just the leader has a basic phone, you know, and then the rest do not have any form of phone to communicate, and yet they need medical, they need their ARVs, which they are scheduled to pick, and yet they are not allowed to move anymore. And yet when you look at technology, we have the telemedicine. They can't work in such community, you know. Such advanced technologies cannot work in such communities. So until we make efforts to go to such communities and then make a study that involves them and understand their priority needs, you know, they need medicine, they need information on maybe agriculture. So the phones should have that kind of information that really entices them to also to keep using these services, to keep using these devices. And also when we have customized smartphones, for instance, that are meant for women, then at least to me, I believe to some extent, it will stop the men from taking charge of these smartphones once they've handed over to like a household, to like a lady of the household, because then the information there really contains, you know, that is important and relevant to the woman and the girl child. So those are really some of the ways. And then that's to address something like social norms and women simply being consumers of these products and not being part of the design. And then the other thing that I find still kind of lacking in the humanitarian space is we seem to be still having that, what products that we have to give out. Is it about food? Is it, yes, all are important. Food, like maybe fertilizers or whatever they feel can really be important. But there is something that I personally feel that we've left out, and it's really important. We keep talking about lack of access to digital devices to these people during crisis, but we do not think about giving these digital devices, making something affordable that we can equip with these communities so that they're able to share and have access to information during such times, you know, when they really need it. Like one of the things that we had to do was to mobilize through friends, like Revi, we managed to get some smartphones that we gave out to these women in the communities, you know, and it helped them a lot during the pandemic because there was no movement at all, and yet these are people who really needed, you know, the group of HIV/AIDS group of women who really needed this kind of support. And so we had to give in these smartphones, which were affordable, but it was just basically to allow them to communicate to each other. They tend to encourage each other to say, look here, don't give up. You need to take your medication. You have a child to live for, because most of them get discouraged. So how far can we go with whatever we are giving out to support the communities during a crisis? Is it simply food, or can we go an extra mile and then give something like the smartphones, affordable smartphones that can keep them online, and they are ready to open up to learn more and explore and use them. Yeah. Thank you very much for now. Over to you.
Thank you, Lillian. You raised a number of points on appropriateness, on accessibility. Benita, I assume a big challenge of your work is what is described as advising on the ethical and appropriateness use of ICT. So I'm sure you have a lot to share with us on that, and you've learned a lot. So the floor is yours, and thank you so much again for being here today with us.
Oh, wonderful, thank you. And I just want to say again, Sophia, thank you so much for your opening and the wonderful research that you've done. I learned a lot from it, and I think it's just so important to have people really doing deep dives into all of these aspects. So thank you for that. And Lillian, I 500% agree with everything that you said there. I thought that was really insightful. And I wanted to actually pick up on the topic of ethics, also sort of pick up on one thing that that Lillian mentioned in terms of designing with women, which is so important. But as I think Sophia alluded to earlier, that's also sometimes it becomes a bit of a buzzword, right? So I think if we're going to do the right thing by people, and this is also where ethics comes into play, it's really making sure that we're thinking about who we're including, right? So this means if and how we're going about it. So what you see a lot in the sector and where the wheels kind of start coming off the wagon is you'll have people say, okay, we're going to go and design with women. So let's organize a design workshop, which is great. But if you look at who is invited to that design workshop, it's often people in an area that have the most access to everything. But your project is to design for people who have the least access. Right. So things like if you're just expecting people to be able to turn up at the workshop, but you're not providing any kind of public transportation options for them, which may be a little bit too expensive, or if you're reaching out to people about this workshop through mediums that the people that you actually want to talk to don't have access to. This happens a lot. And I do think that touches on ethics, because as practitioners, it is our job to not just say we're designing with women. It's our job to really sit down and critically make sure, plan it out and make sure that we are doing the right thing by the women that we are designing for. And that really does include having a look at how those design workshops and things are done. And I would say there's a great resource also bouncing off Sophia's comment about toolkits. There's a fabulous one that came out a few years ago now, which is the ICT and technology toolkit. I'll double check if I just got that title right or wrong or flipped it around. We can link it in the chat, but it's a great toolkit which really goes through step by step what you need to look for in terms of access, in terms of safeguarding, in terms of ethics, how to go about it ethically. As Sophia also mentioned, if you sort of just dump this on a team and say job done, they know now. It is quite lengthy. So what I like to do, for example, and what I have been doing with my country offices is before we even make a decision about technology, so we don't kind of get everybody in a group and say, let's dream up an app. We really go through this toolkit and customize the baseline that we need to conduct to make sure that we have a fix on the access that people have and an idea around safeguarding and things that may cause harm. I think one of the reasons that I love this toolkit so much is that it does allow you to sort of tap around issues that could allude to active GBV situations in people that you're trying to reach. So without, you know, it does it in a manner that doesn't make them sort of say it expressly. From the way that you ask things and what you're getting out of that evaluation, you can make reasonable assumptions. And this is really important in terms of ethics and safeguarding as well. So I think that's just a little bit more the practical side of ethics. It's really practitioners understanding, you know, we've got to do more than just talk the talk. We really need to think critically and make sure if we say we want to reach the most vulnerable women in place X, that we start out with, as Lillian suggested, designing with the women, but actually with those women, not the women in the capital city in the middle income or high income range of that country who you're actually not targeting. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense. I think also on the terms of ethics, something that we need to start thinking more about now, particularly in conflict. So I work in a lot of conflict contexts, also post-conflict and fragile. So when we think it could start to go in that direction. Yeah, what we really need to realize there is that while more people have access to technology, including the people that we want to be reaching, so do certain governments, so do certain regimes, so do certain groups that may do harm to our constituents. So we need to be really careful and really start thinking in terms of publishing what we're doing in some contexts with technology, right? Because we love to, you know, increase access to service X and then do a video montage of it and then publish it. And then if the wrong actors get hold of that, you've put the people in the video at risk. You've potentially put the INGO at risk. So that's the in-country staff, that's international staff, and then ultimately INGOs operating in these contexts. So when we're working in really fragile conflict contexts, trust is everything. It's been built up by years by organizations working in these contexts. And if certain groups start to not trust you, everybody is at risk, including your beneficiaries. So I think in terms of ethics, we also have to be thinking, again, really deeply about not just we have this great idea and we want to increase access here and then we want to tell the world about it. I think we have to really start thinking about when do we decide we're still going to go ahead with this, it's safe enough. But if we start publishing this, we're actually going to start putting people at risk. And that to me has a lot to do with ethics and really understanding your role, the privilege that you have to work on the practitioner side of things and to work with and for people, and really making sure that you are doing absolutely everything to make sure that you're not causing any unintended harm. So I might just wrap a little bit and hand it back over to Patrick.
No, this is great. I think it's a segue to a number of questions that have been raised in the chat. So again, I want to encourage everyone to pose their question in the Q&A section. as you were mentioning, I mean, in general, humanitarian action has been on gender equity has been rather inadequate within the system, and of course in the delivery as well. You talked about tokenism in many ways when it comes to consultation, and kind of almost check marks, and meeting some of the requirements but not necessarily doing it in a meaningful way. Extractive practices that are continuing, and you talked about some of the examples of GBV, and a number of questions. In fact, we're talking about broadly protection. How can technology help? But we do want to avoid the language of doing something for women, right? It's about doing with. And so in the area of protection, unintended consequences, we've seen cash transfer, for example, being rapidly emerging as I think it's about 20% now of all humanitarian assistance, but we also have seen consequences like transactional sex, resulting from those kind of practices. So do you, and this is for all three, do you have recommendations? Are there, good example, lessons learned on how to strengthen broadly protection of women when it comes to the creation, deployment, use of technology in the field?
I'd say balls in your court, Lillian, and I'll jump in afterwards. I'm just going to fussick around and find this toolkit, so we can pop that in the link.
That would be great. Thank you. Lillian, over to you then. You've been put on the spot and not by me, so I'm happy.
Yes. At the moment, what I can say is there's nothing really that concrete that I could really point us to say as a protection mechanism that is in place when we are deploying this. But what we have done is to basically work with the local leaders in our approach. To reach out to these communities. We have worked with the local leaders, but also a lot of capacity building that we've done. Just to sensitize whatever we are taking to them, to sensitize them about the expectations and basically how to go about it. And it's a whole kind of a circle which involves basically from the community and then the capacity building bit. Maybe Sophia can add something.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, thank you, Lillian. I think that's a very important point that you mentioned. I would just say that, in general, general recommendations would be to really, capacity building strategies to deal with issues at the community level, as Lillian was mentioning, also evaluating safe access to ICTs. I think that should be a requirement of any ICT assessment that is conducted. And also consultation with women about what they consider safe access to ICTs to avoid causing unintentional harm, training and capacity building. Again, I think that's really important, teaching women about the risk associated with the use of digital tools and how to safely use technology and the internet, for example. And then on the part of the humanitarians, I think it's really important to put systems in place to respond to protection issues, online harassment, and as a result of the intervention. I think that should be also part of any program, and also ensure that if there is a digital solution that is being put in place, that consultation with women is a priority, because they are the ones who really know what are the risks and what are the potential solutions. So I think that would be my recommendations in that area.
I might just,
Benita.
sorry, Patrick, go for
No,
it.
please go ahead, please.
Okay, I was just going to jump in there with a few practical examples that I think could underscore the points that Lillian and Sophia have just made. So if we have a look during COVID, and this is not my organization, and these are also not the views of my organization. I just put that disclaimer in there again. So we saw a lot of initiatives happening around GBV and around reaching people with technology, and some of these included things like creating a hotline which women that were locked in a house with their abuser could call and say, hey, I'm being abused. And then somebody would call back to have a conversation with her husband and say, did you know that you really shouldn't abuse your wife? And do this whole, right? So I don't think I can see all your faces go into too much detail about how much danger that puts somebody in an active GBV situation, into the point that I wonder how many people actually used it, because if you're in that situation, you're and it's a very bad situation, you're starting to try and think, how do I get out? How do I survive? Not how do I call a hotline so that they can call me back in a week and have a conversation with my husband, and then it'll be fine because he'll be educated. So I think that's really an example. Again, it touches on ethics there, but where maybe particular technology was available, but it wasn't really thought through. So I think especially with technology and GBV, it is so hard not to do harm. I think you need to know when to say no, when to say it's not safe enough, that's going to cause harm. I also really liked Patrick's example where he touched on cash transfers and getting cash to people, which is so important. And again, if we're talking about GBV, we know the main reason people can't is that they are financially dependent. So getting cash to people is really important. I'm going to take an example now from Afghanistan, which again was not my organization, just happened by a few players in the sector. It wasn't specifically GBV, it wasn't a GBV cash program, but it was because after the Taliban regained control, banks shut down, people were not able to withdraw a great amount of money, and it was a question around how do we get money to some of our female staff or vulnerable females. And so some organizations did try crypto, which sounds like a good idea, but they didn't control the entire line. Okay, so at some point that crypto has to become cash. So if you don't control the person who is handing out the cash, and you're trying to implement something that goes against what the Taliban is saying is allowed, so women couldn't just go and try and pick up cash. They had to take a male member or male, their husband or something with them. So at the end of the day, you heard a lot of people proclaiming that this cash is reaching women, but there were a lot of examples where the full amount was not being distributed, and in any case, it was going directly to the guy. So it's not like she has any agency over how that's spent or any choice. And in a situation where someone may be in an active GBV situation, she's basically just going with him to pick up the cash. She's not got any kind of a chance of getting out if financial dependency is holding her back through that. But programs like to proclaim that she does. So I think, yeah, I think especially in GBV, he goes in with very good intentions, but really understanding the context and understanding when, no, this is actually just going to do harm. This is going to put people at undue risk, or not help anything at all. I think just one last example, which is not necessarily a technology example of that, but we do have some countries, for example, where women cannot access shelters without their husband's permission. So if they leave and they go to a shelter and they haven't got their husband's permission, they are sent back by the police. And that's often the last that you hear from them, right? So there's a lot of programs that are sort of very US centric, like just realize you have rights, just realize you can leave, but they don't take the context and the actual laws into consideration. So sometimes these are in classes, sometimes these are distributed digitally or in community centers, but this kind of thing really needs to be thought through. That's just 3 examples there. I was going to give you 2, but there's 3 examples there. I think of where we can all see in hindsight what should have perhaps been considered to stop any of that happening.
And Patrick, just very quickly, I just wanted to thank you, Benita, because I remembered, I mean, there are also, there are examples, and I also wanted to mention chatbots and virtual spaces that have been created recently to provide resources and services to women experiencing online harassment and other forms of gender-based violence. And also GIS technology, for example, has allowed women to develop mapping tools that can alert other women of safety risks, not related to digital, but physical GBV. So that's all I wanted to mention.
No, this has been so rich. Please, Benita, continue, please.
I was just going to say very quickly on the chatbots. There's a lot, and there's some that are done really well, but again, that really depends on who you're targeting and understanding the type of access people have. So I've seen things before where when we do a proper baseline, we see, okay, there's one phone in the family. The woman has the least access. She's an active GBV victim. If we're encouraging her through community centers or anything to sort of contact this bot and get advice, and she doesn't have high ICT literacy or real control of that phone when he discovers that little bot chat, we've just put her at enormous risk as well. So I think it's so important to do those baselines and really understand what access looks like and the risks.
Thank you all. This is exactly the kind of discussion we were hoping for, but obviously then it makes us wish we had another hour, and we're almost at the end. We have a number of questions, true, that we will not be getting to. Sophia, I know you have your hand, but I just want to quickly hand over so we can make final comments, and maybe you can do that. So apologies for those comments that won't be raised, but the discussion was so rich and raised important, some very fundamental questions around, basic principles and international norms around the treatment of women versus local kind of dynamics, and fundamentally questions of do no harm, and the code that has been around for a certain time now around digital do no harm, around what you're mentioning, not safe enough. Well, really prioritize protection, prioritizing safety as a broad concept, not just physical security, over at times what are really just efficiency gains driving technology innovation. Perhaps on the last comment, so I'll just hand over so you can each give a final comments, but maybe one of the aspect that would be great if you could touch on is this aspect of digital literacy, data literacy. And a lot of the excuses, frankly, often that we hear is, well, there's not there's not enough knowledge, so they can't really contribute because they are not familiar with these things. Obviously, we don't ascribe to that kind of comments, but at the same time, there is a question of who is responsible ultimately for building digital literacy, for ensuring that when people give consent, they really understand what consent means. That, you know, so there's really important gaps there. So maybe in your final comments, you can give some thoughts on that and then make broader conclusions. So we'll hand over to you, and then we'll unfortunately have to say goodbye to everyone. But so final round of comments, thoughts on this discussion and maybe the digital literacy. Sophia, maybe I can start with you.
Sure. Yes. So I think that, yes, training and capacity building, it's so important. And it's something that, you know, humanitarian organizations need to focus more on. And that's why it's so important to really have the time to work on these issues prior to our crisis. But I have to say that, you know, training and capacity building, that needs to be done in a way that is that fits in women's schedules. You need to really take into consideration their everyday burdens and try to fit in whenever is possible. But definitely it's something that it's extremely important. But I would say that in addition to digital training, I would emphasize what Lillian has talked about before, about really also advocating for women with local communities so that they can actually be part of these trainings, and this capacity building is as important as the actual training. And just like very quickly, I would say that generally speaking, I think that we just need to put in place just sensible and common sense human-centered design, you know, focusing on, you know, the groups that we're targeting, the groups that we're trying to help, really understanding them and putting them in the driver's seat, so that they can really benefit from the programs and have a say in the solutions that are implemented. And it's also about asking better questions. I think it's just having like 3 or 4 questions before you're rolling out a program to very much understand what is the situation, what is the access, what are the risks, you know, and keep asking those questions throughout the program cycle, not just at the very beginning, because there's always, you know, there might be some groups that are not using your services, the assistance. So you need to keep asking, why are these groups, or what are the groups that are not using this technology? What kind of women? Why are they not using the technology? Have we involved them enough, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that those would be my 2 final comments.
Lillian?
Yes, thank you very much. Just to add on a little bit, we can also, in terms on how to tackle, for instance, the digital literacy issues, we can look at family level, capacity building to family, to household levels, to make sure at least one literate, maybe it can be a girl, a student in the home, is the one now that would be responsible to teach the rest of the family members on the digital tools. So that could be one of them. But most importantly, we have women-led community initiatives that are at the grassroots and that are really working, that you could work with to get answers to some of these solutions, to implement some of these projects, and yes, basically to assist, to make sure that the support is provided. Yeah, thank you.
Benita.
Thank you. I'm going to end with a bit of a hard truth, and it would be that it's really not good enough to just want to do good. Either you are or you're not. And if you're not, it's probably because you haven't gone beyond the buzzwords and done your research, frankly, at this point. So I think that's like, if there's one thing that I'd like people to take away with. It's to really, really reflect on that and have a look at the tools that we have available. For example, this gender and ICT toolkit, have a look at making that more accessible to your teams, working with them, customizing it with them, and also having a look at great resources such as the Principles for Digital Development, right? They have a lot of courses, they have a lot of webinars, and those are a set of living principles. So they are updated, but it's just a great place to always go to and check in with in terms of looking at how you're going about designing from the get-go. So yeah, that would be my main point. And if I could sneak in one more point, it would be baselines, baselines, baselines.
And
that's me.
And to continue with Sophia, baseline is great, but you do have to monitor through the process. But I will end here in thank you all. I think from the last comment, it is clear that the solutions are known. I mean, it's not rocket science. You know, as you mentioned, there's so much out there already in terms of resource, and what's really needed are shift in mindsets, really political commitment, political will to actually get this done at scale. But it also requires people like you, Lilian, Sophia, Benita, who continuously work on that, this issue, push the agenda and change the system. So I want to again thank you all for the work that you do, for talking to us today, and look forward to continue engaging in the future. Sarah, who moderated the previous panels, has posted the link to the case study. We look forward to your comments on that as well. And once more, thank you all for your participation today. It was fantastic to hear your perspective. I wish you all a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
See you. Bye.